I will not be here next week, and next week's meeting and a few after that will be on Mitch's conference link, which he has given here under the October 13th.
We have the meeting invite updated as well in the calendar.
Okay.
So if you've subscribed to updates on the calendar, you should see it automatically. If you've copied the events from the calendar, then you will not see it.
So today we have to talk about, Mitch will be talking about personas. Greg and Lynn will be talking about HTTP and TCP client settings. And I wanted to talk about a new command that I have that is going to hopefully help resolve this issue with listing control planes when you have more than one. Mitch, do you want to start with personas and roles?
Yeah, let's do that. So this document is not quite ready for review yet, but it's getting close and it's changed a lot since we've looked at it last. So I wanted to get some early feedback from you all about the direction. The purpose of this document is to clarify and give a framework for discussion of different types of users that we support as a project. So roles sort of refer to atomic sets of permissions and actions that are going to be needed by people in different roles. Personas are fictional people who will have one or more roles in the Istio project as users. And so it gives us a way to talk about, we've used things like the external control plane admin and sort of what their sort of needs as a user looks like versus application owners. The idea is to give a framework for discussion and have sort of these touchstone combinations of roles that we can refer back to. So Ed, if you want to scroll down to the roles section. Thank you. Probably our most common role for anyone using Istio is an application developer. Sorry, an application operator, but I decided to start with developers and sort of follow the software supply chain from start to finish. Ideally, a developer doesn't need to be deeply aware of Istio. But they do need to understand some of the implications of Istio for software development. For instance, they should understand if the mesh is providing MTLS, they should have that confidence to not add MTLS or SSL to their application code. There are a few things that can cause breakages in the service mesh, using UDP, failing to propagate trace span headers. So there's just a handful of things that an application developer needs to be aware of when writing an application on top of Istio. But by and large, they're not explicitly users of Istio. They're not going to be installing a control plane or writing any config. Any questions on application developers? All right. Application operators are the key user of Istio, as mentioned before. These are the people who are going to be responsible for taking the code that an application developer has written and configuring it with virtual services, retry policies, destination rules, authentication policies. All of the Istio config that is specific to an application is written by the application operator. The key thing to call out here is that the application operator role does not have administrative access to the control plane. So things like accessing the traditional debug APIs in istiod are not feasible for an application operator. Questions there?
Would the application operator be able to configure like global mesh settings? I'm guessing no.
No, that would be out of scope for an application operator. And I will point out that these are roles. So there are going to be some personas that have multiple roles, such as application operator and mesh operator, in which case that individual would be able to set these global policies. But I do think it's best to deal with them as distinct roles.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Ram? Does that make sense?
No, I agree with that. That's the answer I was hoping for. I wanted to kind of separate things like the sidecar injector config map. The stuff that goes in there would be probably a mesh operator, and anything that we deem that the application operator needs to configure would be moved as like a pod annotation, for example.
Yes, agreed. There is some gray area there with regard to gateways and host names. It may be reasonable for an application operator to create a new host name rule using a virtual service that's tagged to a gateway. That is somewhat global in that they could potentially take over host names that are logically owned by other application operators. So we need to, it's going to be a little bit difficult to draw a super fine line between application operators and mesh operators in a couple of spaces. And we'll need to pay attention to that in terms of what we recommend in terms of best practices.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, with things like delegation, it might be clearer what we recommend as best practice for mesh operators versus what we delegate to application operator using like the delegation APIs.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So the mesh operator is responsible for the installation and upgrade of the control plane, for setting any mesh-wide policies. As we were just discussing, they probably also own gateways and ingress for the most part. I don't think I've called that out here, so I need to add that specifically to this section. Usually during an outage, it's expected that a mesh operator is sort of level 2 support. First, the application operator would need to prove that the problem is not a part of their application's code or their application's Istio config, and then they would escalate to a mesh operator for a problem that could potentially be sort of a platform problem, if that makes sense. Mesh operators do have administrative privileges to the control plane, and so the mesh operator may not have access to the application execution context. In particular, if we think of the external control plane use case, this may be a completely different cluster. And so they're able to do whatever they need to in the control plane cluster, but in the application cluster, they may have no access whatsoever. The next role is the Kubernetes cluster operator. This is not an Istio user directly, but it is someone who the Istio users will depend on. Both the mesh and application operators will depend on the Kubernetes cluster operator for their orchestration. So it's worth calling out here. SecOps is an area that is kind of a bit new in terms of Istio, and I hope to get input from the security and product security working groups in terms of what the needs of a security operator are from Istio. But in particular, there are a number of organizations that divide this out from mesh operations or application operations because they're responsible for the security of all infrastructure around the application, whether we're talking about the mesh or Kubernetes orchestration, whether we're talking about particular values for one service, SecOps can be involved kind of end to end. So we need to explore more deeply what their needs are as users.
And they're doing things at the beginning, like setting policies for the whole mesh, but also things at the end, like auditing.
That's right. So I, for one, don't have a good understanding of the access needs of a security operator. If there's someone in the meeting who has a more intimate understanding of this use case, I would invite you to modify the document. So now we move kind of farther and farther away from traditional Istio users, but these are use cases that we do have some degree of support for. Istio vendors, I think each of the major companies contributing to Istio is contributing to it in part in order to be able to offer their own application platform that involves Istio. So these vendors may offer extended support on Istio versions. They may be offering something like a managed version of Istio that doesn't require the same install and upgrade, but is just sort of ubiquitously available in the application platform. These are users of Istio. And in many cases, an Istio vendor is going to be like an extreme power user of Istio. So they will have unique needs as users. Lastly, the Istio add-on developer. This traditionally looked like mixer add-ons, but of course, with the change to WASM-oriented telemetry, that's changed. And now add-on developers are going to kind of take two different, how would I describe it? Two different categories. One would be Istio add-ons like Prometheus, Grafana, and Kiali, where it's an additional technology that requires installation alongside Istio and enhances the functionality of the mesh. For instance, without a telemetry sync, Istio does not provide good observability. We are not a platform altogether. We are simply one piece of the puzzle that makes up an application platform. So telemetry syncs would be one of the add-ons. In the other category of add-ons would be people who are writing particular WASM extensions to Istio to add functionality to it. This is a pretty new space because WASM is still approaching maturity as a feature. But at the very least, we see that like Datadog, I believe, is working on a WASM extension to Istio to provide their own format of telemetry and trace data directly from the data plane. There are a number of other options out there. Ed, I know you've explored some WASM use cases. You might be better suited than I am to expand on that type of add-on developer.
Right, and it's because you can do so many things with add-ons running in the data plane, there's a lot of security implications that we haven't bolted down. And that's going to be important as we move forward as well.
I did have a question on one of the earlier personas, if you can scroll up. Yeah, so like the mesh operators. So as you know, like Google and IBM Cloud both have like managed Istio for our users. So the platform, at least in our case, the platform manages the installation and the upgrade of the control plane. So that means we generate and own and manage the Istio operator API. But the user, or in this case, like the mesh operator of the customer cluster, would tell us when they want this upgrade to happen. So I think this persona, there's still this persona that exists on the customer side, on the user side. But what about the set of responsibilities that are on the platform side? So the Istio operator side.
Maybe we should split this role into control plane operator and mesh operator, where the mesh operator would be on the user side in that analogy and setting mesh-wide policies, while the control plane operator would be on the IBM side responsible for the health and orchestration of the control plane.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm getting at.
Okay.
And I know like Red Hat Service Mesh might be in like a similar boat as to what they allow the users to configure and what they configure. But
yeah, I can speak to that. So we manage things through our operator. So, and the control plane components have been scaled down. So the you could say the mesh operator and the control plane operator are effectively the same person. Although you could also say the mesh operator is the operator component running behind the scenes.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've essentially reduced what functions that we have listed here the user is actually responsible for. And that is that the user is going to be responsible for setting mesh-wide policies, control ingress gateways, that sort of thing. But they aren't responsible for, say, installing a new version of istiod. Instead, they would just elect when they begin consuming that new version of istiod. Is that right?
That's basically how the operator model works, correct?
Hey, actually, now that I say that out loud, I do have a clarification question there. Is it the mesh operator or the application operator who decides when to begin consuming a new version of istiod?
I would say the mesh operator.
Yeah, so In our case, there's not really a huge distinction. Well, actually, I take that back. So it's going to be the mesh operator, because when the operator itself is installed is where the update policy is specified. So whoever is installing the operator is specifying whether they want to do automatic updates or manual updates, so that if they're doing manual updates, what'll happen is when an update comes in, they'll be notified of it and they'll have to go and manually approve that update, which will roll out a new operator, which will then roll out the changes across the control planes that are installed in the cluster.
Okay, so it sounds like the mesh operator is capable of causing all of the sidecars to get re-injected on an upgrade, or of delegating that to the application owners to do in their own time frame.
Well, for us, we currently delegate that to the application owner. Because we don't currently know whether or not we can roll out a new deployment without causing problems with the application. So we actually document to tell users to, do like a kubectl rollout, recreate, or whatever it is on their applications to get new injection on their deployments. Although we have been talking about adding flags to say, hey, if I have, this label or annotation, whatever, on my deployment, then I will delegate that back to the control plane, so that when the control plane gets upgraded, it can go, okay, these apps are okay if I just restart them, and everybody's happy. So,
okay.
Go ahead.
You raised some really interesting points. I'm thinking that maybe what we should do is, at the end of this document, have an example workflow for an upgrade on a managed service. And then we can talk about what personas and what roles are involved in each stage of that process. And that can not only help clarify, because upgrades are a pretty complex flow, but also it can help be an example for other working groups as they seek to use these roles and personas for their critical user journeys.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. In fact, we can expand that from not just the upgrade. While I agree that upgrade covers quite a lot of the complex personas, but we can also upgrade that. Expand that to cover other scenarios if we need to.
Okay. I think that sounds like a good plan. Any other comments on the roles before we start looking at personas? All right. So personas are meant to be real people. And as I read up on best practices around developing personas, of course, I'm not a user experience researcher, so I don't have the expertise in this area, but based on a few Wikipedia articles and a few Medium blog posts, they're designed to represent real people that you can relate to. Personas have gender, age, personality types. Not that you explicitly list all of those. This isn't meant to be a spreadsheet, but they're meant to be relatable and identifiable, so that you can tell how they would perceive a particular user experience. So I clearly don't have enough personas listed, and I also need to flesh out more about these personas. Like Stefan, all I've got is the role that he fills listed. We need to expand that out, make them feel like flesh and blood people that are relatable. But these are what I have so far. Winona, in particular, is probably the user that we've thought of most historically as a project. And that is the startup employee who is they're responsible for everything. They're going to kick the tires on the new technology. They're going to test it against maybe their staging cluster. They're going to roll it out in production and then set their own configuration up. It's a one-stop shop for all of the Istio roles in Winona. Except for probably not an add-on developer or Istio vendor, but from security operations all the way up to application developer, Winona wears all the hats at her company. Noriko, on the other hand, is an employee at Initech, which is a name I stole from Office Space. Hopefully there's no copyright concerns there. It seemed like a generic enough technology company name. And the idea is that Initech actually has their own internal application platform that Istio is just a part of. And so Noriko owns developing and operating one application inside of Initech on this application platform. So as such, she would fill the role of application developer and application operator. while Stefan would be the mesh operator, the newly coined control plane operator and Kubernetes cluster operator. I also need to add a SecOps persona, I think, for Initech, which I think would be logically separate from Noriko and Stefan. But that's kind of what I've got so far. What do you guys think of where I'm taking this? Are personas useful? I know they're a little bit more, I don't know, touchy-feely than developers are used to. It's a little bit of a different thing. Are these something that would be useful, or should we just stick to roles?
How do you envision the working groups use these personas? The roles are more clear to me, but the personas, I mean, they obviously require more work as it means that the person who's doing the work or the Epic owner needs to now also go learn all the personas.
So the motivation in roles is to be very distinct, to carve up into more or less the smallest useful slice the types of operations that are done by users. Real world users don't fall into those categories. Real world users will belong to one or many roles. They'll wear many hats, as we see Winona and even Stefan doing. So I wanted to kind of, I think the goal of personas is to help us relate to real world users that don't fall into our clean categories. I think. I don't know. To be honest, I'm still reading blog posts and Wikipedia articles on how all of this works. This is not my forte.
So in the past, when I've used personas, some people have learned them really quickly and others are always confused. Well, which one's that one? And then they're in meetings, they're embarrassed to ask if they don't know what Noriko does. And I have found it requires everyone to put, half an hour in to get all these roles down.
Do you think there's value there, Ed, or is it kind of half an hour of toil?
So if everybody does it, then everyone can speak more efficiently about the topics. But if only some people do it, it's more efficient to stick with the roles. So once you have 2/3 of the people using the personas and 1/3 not, it gets awkward.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess the personas, I would appreciate easy pronounced names too. Some of these names are a little bit harder to pronounce for me.
Yeah, I've struggled with that. On the one hand, we do want them to be easy to pronounce, and that's important for communication and quick touchstone reference back to the personas. Trying to reflect diverse names that don't imply various biases that we might bring about who Istio users are, while keeping them pronounceable at the same time. I'm really struggling to do that, frankly. I think it's very easy to pronounce the name Joe, and it's easy to read. At the same time, if I were to give North American stereotypically Caucasian names, I don't think that would do our users any service.
Can we steal personas from something else? Like does CNCF have any personas?
I have no idea. That's an interesting idea.
Okay, so you said this is not ready for review. Should everyone just read this and make comments on it, or are we going to talk about this again next week?
So I would love to have comments. This was more, I wanted to check in and make sure that, if I'm going to invest another, say, 10 hours on this, that I'm at least going in a direction that people like. Once the document is more fleshed out with more personas and with maybe that sample use case that we talked about of upgrades, then I think it would be ready for approval and we can communicate it out to the other working groups.
Well, no, I can't comment on the personas yet, but the roles I think is definitely worth the time invested in this, because I really think that a lot of the solutions that we come up with for problems that that people are raising, the roles help us make sure that the solution that we build is is the right role, or is in the scope of the role. But yeah, I think the roles is definitely good work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think the roles are tremendously useful. I guess one thing I would think us through is how do you want other people in their design doc to reference your role? That's some of the separation necessary, I guess. For example, application developer and application operator, I think they are mostly just one role, with DevOps being like you do both dev and op. So I think those are the role I would commonly refer to as service owner. I guess my challenge to you would be, is there any simplification we can build on these roles? Is the divide the right line so that it's easy for other people to reference these roles in their design doc was remember all these roles?
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you feel that application developers and application operators are ever distinct people, or are they always one role?
I mean, from an Istio perspective, I don't feel the distinction, but I could be curious to hear other people's voice as well. I mean, I've been always referring them as one role.
If you follow the squad model, there's one squad who's doing development and then deploying and being responsible for pager duty if it fails. Other groups seem to have developers who then throw it across to operators. Kind of want to have both in case you're using the other model.
I work a lot with application operators, and I know that the role of an application developer is different, because when I ask them to make a code change, there's like an immediate resistance to that, because that means they have to go involve somebody else, the image has to be rebuilt. So I think like the boundary is always like an image exists in a registry, and they're just trying to get that to work.
So I think then, Lynn, in response to your question, it sounds like it makes sense to keep these roles separate, but to write personas, one of whom represents the DevOps model, which I think is captured in Noriko, as she's the application operator and developer. And then another persona that would leverage more of the SRE model, where the developers and operators are distinct. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the value of personas, is they can represent the diversity of the ways that Istio is used. I still think that most of the time when we think of users, unfortunately, we're thinking of Winona, which is a real user. We certainly see lots of people doing it, but we're finding that for enterprise use cases, that is not generally a useful persona. And we want to be equally valuable to both of those scenarios.
I mean, that's fair. You're absolutely right. I think most of our users we work with, they don't necessarily own individual services. The first team that look at Istio is normally the platform team who sets their service mesh adoption for the team. So they're looking at overall strategy for adopting service mesh across multiple services.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've seen that a lot in users. I know even 2 years ago, I think AutoTrader was doing this. They got highlighted in the Kubernetes podcast. And frankly, it's a way to get a new level of reliability and predictability out of Istio. A lot of the feedback I'm hearing from users is that Istio is not the kind of thing where you're going to just go into production and make a config change and hope that it works. Instead, application operators have a limited number of knobs that they can turn. They're integrated with the application, and then the changes are automatically rolled out through some sort of staging pipeline in order to validate that they're good config changes. So I'm hopeful that these personas can help us better serve those enterprise users.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think those are the value of persona that we can provide consolidated role, because a lot of times a person might be doing one or two or more roles in enterprise.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will continue expanding this document. Probably 2 to 3 weeks from now, we can revisit it. It is a P0 for 1.8, but of course, there's no code associated with it, so the feature freeze is not applicable. I'd just like to have it in place for other working groups to make use of in the 1.9 development process.
One last thing I wanted to add, Mitch. I was thinking, what if we introduced the roles or even personas into the various templates that we have for GitHub issues, like, bug report, feature request, or do you think that would be useful if you identified a bug for you to also say, I don't know, maybe we link them to a page where all the roles are clearly defined, where they can pick, one or more of these roles, and they can specify what their role is along with their issue. And I'm thinking that this could help us, when we come up with a solution. Well, I'm thinking that, when we come up with a solution, a fix for this issue, then we make sure that we target the right role, right? So we're not coming up with a fix where the platform owner has to specify some global mesh as a solution to an application developer, for example's problem.
I think that's a great idea to get feedback from users. It also sort of validates or invalidates personas and gives us a way to say, hey, we really didn't cover this combination of roles anywhere. We should expand, or we haven't found any users who align with this persona. Maybe it's not that useful.
Exactly. Yep. Agree. Or we learned that, every single issue users are picking all the roles. So we know that, everyone's wearing multiple hats here.
Yeah.
Thanks for your work on this, Mitch.
My pleasure. And I have to give a whole bunch of credit to Steve Dake, who actually wrote the first draft of this. I'm just building on his foundation.
Excellent. Lynn, are you and Greg ready to talk about this?
Yes, we would love to briefly talk about this. So I think Greg is tied up in a release management meeting, so I will represent both of us. Some of you probably have seen this document, just pulling out too. So essentially what we are looking at driving is consolidate the HTTP and TCP client settings. So far there's multiple challenges in this area. From a destination rule perspective, today it has like TCP traffic values such as TCP connect timeout, but there's no way to do it globally within the destination rule. You actually have to go to mesh config, connect timeout to change the default connect timeout. So it's pretty inconsistent. From virtual service perspective, for HTTP request timeout and retries today, you configure it in virtual services, which is also super confusing because it's not fundamentally different than the TCP connect timeout, which is typically configured in destination rule. But also, we don't have a way for user to configure global HTTP request timeout and retries. I mean, global for timeout, there's an environment variable, which we don't necessarily support. Environment variable, you guys all know, is experimental. It's never intended to be proper API, and there was no global way to set retries. So that's the background for this design doc. Throughout this design doc, we are looking at proposing a consistent way for user to set globally, I should say for mesh admin to set globally these type of networking configurations, such as request timeout and request retry, and also TCP timeout. So Ed, if you could maybe scroll down to solution 1. So that's the solution we landed up. We've been present this multiple times to environment and networking work group. And through these work groups, we landed on this particular solution that we don't want to introduce new objects to our user. So we want a user to continue using destination rules to configure these network settings. So we are going to have global destination rule, which means destination rule deployed in Istio system namespace, or destination rule deployed in the Istio root namespace. So these would be served as global destination rule, and through the global destination rule, user can mesh admin can configure globally these connect timeout and keep alive for TCP, the HTTP retry and the timeout, and also some of the locality load balancer settings. So it would be all configured through the global destination rule on the global setting. A couple of caveats would be, how these deprecation going to work. I think this is where, the user experience work group is involved. We want to make sure you guys are aware of this. So the deprecation rules are a little bit more complicated. I don't think we have presented this to other work group yet, but the idea is the global, we will continue to honor the configuration specified in virtual services, because the configuration specified in virtual services would be request-based configuration for HTTP requests and retries. So even if in the global destination rule, the mesh admin has specified a global default for HTTP retry or timeout, user can choose to override it either within the destination rule as the new way, or if the user are using legacy way where they use virtual services and they are configured this timeout and retry within their virtual services, we will continue to honor that for probably a long time for backwards compatibility. For mesh config is actually simple because mesh config, the fields will be deprecated in connect timeout, keep alive for TCP and locality load balancer settings. So these configurations, we will read the global destination rule first and read the deprecated field next. But the global destination rule is going to win if both are specified. And I think that from a tooling perspective, on istioctl validate, we would expect the virtual service, whenever it's becoming deprecated, we would expect when user deploy virtual services with a timeout and configuration within virtual services, we would give warning to those YAML, but still allow them to deploy. And then from a mesh config perspective, user are using these deprecated warnings, we would expect to give user warnings during upgrade. So they would be alerted, hey, these are deprecated, please move to the new way to specify these settings. Any questions?
Then I have some questions about how this works with external control plane. If I'm in an application cluster that does not have an installation of Istio in it, but instead is relying on an external control plane, what is the Istio system namespace where I would put that default mesh config or destination rule?
So yeah, so that's a good question. So external control plane, the way is designed is even though you don't have istiod installed in your cluster, you still have a corresponding namespace where you deploy your essentials. So that would be the default namespace, and that namespace have to match the namespace where external istiod is deployed. So envision your external istiod is deployed into like istiox namespace, and then all your essential for istiod remote would also need to be deployed into that same istiox namespace. So
Okay.
that would be the default root namespace. And also within mesh config, you can optionally config root namespace. So that's why people could have a different root namespace than Istio system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I follow that. In terms of the application operator role, are they likely to have visibility into that Istio system namespace so that they can at least see what the defaults for the mesh are?
That's a great question. I think it depends on different cloud providers. Like for our cloud, I believe they do. They do have ways to view, and definitely view, privilege to view what's being deployed out there. I think it makes sense for them to have that privilege so they know whether they should choose to overwrite the defaults, right? Because not everybody needs to overwrite the defaults. And the defaults
Yeah,
is
I
there
think
to
in
serve.
particular
Yeah.
things like analyze and how they would look at whether or not the rule is being defaulted and what the defaults are. That would be valuable for them to have that read access, but probably not write access. That would be the mesh operator, I think.
Yeah, agree. Definitely just on the read access for sure. Yeah. I think the impact to external istiod is minimum. The main reason is the mesh config and global destination rule we're talking about here. I think the role is mesh user, which is the user by a third company instead of whoever provide Istio as a service, right? So think about like auto trader Kyle Stoney, he would be, changing these in mesh config today, where tomorrow when we support global destination rule, he would be changing it in the global destination rule instead.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch, for the comment. Any other questions?
It looks good, Lynn. When we get closer to doing it, let's make items for the validators and analyzers.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, thanks so much.
So I have one other item to talk about today, which has to do with our one of our items for 1.8, which is listing control planes. As an experiment, I went through and sort of implemented that to see how it might look, because we've had a long-standing issue to be able to upgrade your control plane with its existing customizations, and we get pushback on that every release. But I wanted to at least, even if I don't get that, I wanted to at least get the listing of control planes down. So imagine you're in a canary. This will change. It won't be manifest list. It'll be experimental istiod list. You'll say list. It'll say, well, you have Istio version 172 with these settings, and Istio version latest, this canary with these settings. This actually works today. This is output of my experimental PR. I think this might solve what we need for listing and also get us on the road to, in a future version, being able to make use of these settings to upgrade people or help them to construct what they need to upgrade. So I wanted to talk about two things with it. We recently had someone merge a log level command for istioctl to set the logs on the control plane. They didn't do it in experimental, which isn't good because it has no integration tests. So my thought was, I'm going to do 2 PRs. One, I'm going to move that log setting command to this new experimental subcommand. And then I'm going to propose that we add this list here, and that this sort of becomes the way for listing control planes, and in the future, upgrading them. So first, what do we think about that? And then I'm going to look for comments on the RFC itself.
That log command is for adjusting log levels, yes?
Yes, the log levels of istiod.
Okay.
So those are commands only sort of, depending on your environment, a mesh operator or Istio service provider would be able to set that level. So these are not ordinary commands anymore. This command, the command to list control planes, each one of these major items is based on an Istio operator. When you use istioctl or the Istio operator to install, it puts that operator into the Istio system namespace. I don't know if that is going to happen in every case for external istiod. It would be nice if it did, so you could sort of see what the customizations were. But this tool reads that and then basically just does a diff between the settings that istioctl itself would install if you tried to install, and what it finds you installed in the cluster. So when I install, I always do pull policy always, because I'm usually using a daily build, and I turn on analysis and this sort of thing. And being able to see this, has really helped me, because I install Istio 20, 30 times a week, and I get with different options to test things, and I get confused about what I've installed when I sit down in the morning. So this RFC, I guess it's still partly in review because there's 2 pieces to it. One is this piece to this admin level command to list the settings that Istio was installed with. And the other is this sort of mesh operator or application operator level command, which has not yet been implemented, to list the sidecars. So currently we have istioctl version, which lists how many sidecars of each version are there. But that is not super useful if you're trying to do canary control planes, because it doesn't know which ones, if you restarted them, they would have a different one, or all of those things. So we talked about this briefly last week. The idea of having a command that lists all of the user's namespaces, default, Istio system, and some other namespace, which control planes are injecting, have been injected, and new pods, which control plane will inject, and then just counts. So the idea is either you upgrade Istio yourself or your cloud provider does, but the data plane has not yet been upgraded. You would run a command like this, maybe this command, that would sort of tell you how many pods are back level, maybe with the names of the deployments, maybe not. And then that would help you to identify which applications need a restart. So I'm not totally finished with these data plane commands yet, but I'm excited about these control plane ones. So do we like that model where earlier there had been some work items that say we should be able to upgrade in place and restart pods. I got a lot of pushback from John Howard and others saying we don't want that. I think Ram said customers don't want it to automatically restart unless there's certain annotations you put on your pod saying it can be restarted. So the idea is that this listing would sort of be very similar to what you get with the analyze command when it tells you that your sidecar is of the wrong control plane version. It was just sort of, but it would break it out by namespace to make it sort of easy to know what to restart. If you got a message your control plane was upgraded, you would find out what to do in your data plane.
Just a question here. Is there any thought been put into adding events into the Istio control plane at all, so that there's something coming through the standard Kubernetes events?
Yeah. Yes. What events are you interested
So
in?
for this year, do we think we'll go back up to?
Oh, I was going to say, like, because this would be, you know, a great example, right? If the control plane is updated, if there was a way that somehow there would be events driving off of that, or even through the proxies themselves, so that the actual user applications, they would have some sort of detail there going, well, somebody updated the control plane. Maybe that's why my thing's not working right. As opposed to more of a, you know, having a manual exercise of going out and checking it and verifying it. Something that's sort of more in your face.
So events were added in Istio 7 at the framework level. But as far as I know, there was no clear use case for them. And so we don't have a lot of events that are, to my knowledge, actually getting published on these. But we have the infrastructure to do so if there are particular events that you would be interested in seeing.
And are those Kubernetes events or XDS events, Mitch?
Kubernetes events. I'd have to check in with Costin on the status there, but his intent was to ship Kubernetes events in 1.8.
Yeah, I think the code's there, but I don't think there's any usage.
I would be much more excited if there were Kubernetes events for this stuff. My thought was just to have this here to help people troubleshoot it when it went wrong while we wait for those. But if those are on the way, I would love to help out with that in any way.
When we talk about the control plane being changed, normally we expect that to be done through a canary process. So I'm not sure where we would write an event for that. Because you actually have two deployments, right? So you can't write events to the deployment level. Can we write events to the service, maybe, that it's sitting behind? No, because there's two services.
Yeah, I was speaking more generally about, you know, the event models, sort of, I think, a better way to go, if possible. If you guys don't think it's possible, that's fine. But I think even from the standpoint of generating an event on the client proxy, if it's not necessarily not version compatible, but working with an older version than what the control plane is currently driving. So, you know, an example here would be, I update the control plane, my app is migrated to use the new control plane, but I haven't re-injected it, and it's therefore continuing to use the older version of the proxy that was injected into it, right? This is something that would be great if you could first determine that and then say, oh, hey, by the way, you know, flash a warning if you think it's a warning, or at least just a generic event saying, oh, you know, FYI. Or maybe this is something that just happens as, you know, through the normal telemetry process through Grafana.
So I think one of the original use cases for Kubernetes events, as Costin was pursuing it, was to have an event that is listed on the proxy every time it reconnects to the control plane, that would indicate not only what control plane service, but also which control plane instance it's connecting to. We would need to follow up with Costin to understand the maturity of that. He's not tracking it on any roadmap. There's no design doc. So.
Yeah, and I'm not saying, I don't think they're foolproof either. And I don't think that would prevent doing anything that Ed's talking about here as well, because, you know, events can be transient. And if you miss it, there's a chance that you're never going to see it, right? Depending on what else has come through.
Yeah, that's right.
But it does give you a way to do alerts and things off of your, you know, normal Kubernetes management, right?
So unless anyone objects, I'm going to move the control plane log setting to experimental. And then I'm going to change my draft PR into a real PR and get comments on the control plane list. And I'm going to finish up the document on how to tell if your data planes are obsolete by namespace. But I agree that we should be moving, as people here have said, towards events and telemetry about that rather than a command. I think the command is going to be for troubleshooting when something goes wrong rather than the mainline way of doing it.
And I do have one small piece of feedback regarding that second command. I think one of our objectives for this release is sort of the rationalization of istioctl commands into more role-oriented groups.
Yes.
These two commands, I believe, would be run by very different roles. One of them being the application operator for list, and the other being the control plane operator for log. So it may be wise to not name them quite so similarly.
That's a good point. And the list, it depends on having the Istio operator there. Will ordinary users have visibility into that? So I had been thinking that I didn't know if people who were doing external istiod were putting an Istio operator, an informational one, into the user's mesh. So I was thinking that perhaps this list was something more that a cloud provider would be doing themselves, and that there was going to be a work on either with the commands you saw there or a different one to sort of list the proxies. And so in that sense, these two would both be sort of admin or cloud provider level commands and not mesh operator, application operator commands. That's why I put them together.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even though we're not there yet, sometimes users still have to look at istiod log to debug things. But I think longer term definitely makes sense. Users shouldn't have to care about how many istiod they have or look at the logs for istiod to troubleshooting problems.
Okay, I will get these things rolling. And like I say, I'm going to be out for a few weeks starting next week. So that is going to affect our feature freeze on the 20th. So I'm going to be doing my best to keep everything that I've promised done and to keep approving PRs, but I'll be hustling for the next week or two. So anyway, next week when we meet, it's going to be on Mitch's conference. And I guess have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.